I want to talk today about prose poetry. We'll start with a bit of history about the form and then get into what exactly prose poetry is. And towards the end, we'll look at some of the examples. It's generally agreed that Baudelaire, who's the founder of modern French poetry, began the trend in prose poetry and remains the poet who had the most influence on the form. It has been written that Baudelaire, was keenly aware while working in prose poetry that it was a new form, that there were no rules, no guidelines, no boundaries with regard to, in particular, subject matter. So France is the home of prose poetry. Rimbaud and Bertrand were also writing prose poetry and eventually abandoned traditional verse altogether and wrote only in prose poetry. And the form continued to develop, especially with Baudelaire, working in the form and writing a lot about it. And I love this quote of his about prose poetry. He writes, "Which of us, in his ambitious moments, has not dreamed of the miracle of a poetic prose, musical, but without conventional rhythm and rhyme, and supple enough to adapt itself to the lyrical impulses of the soul and the undulations of the psyche, the promptings of the unconscious." Baudelaire wrote, too, that prose poetry is more inward. And then Michael Benedict wrote that prose poetry is psychologically truer. And with regard to Baudelaire, even today, many of his prose poems are considered very modern. The trend continued internationally and then eventually made its way to the United States. In the early part of the 1900s, in the teens, Carl Sandburg was writing prose poetry. In the 20s, William Carlos Williams was working in prose poetry. And a number of poets discovered the form during this time, but getting closer to the 60s, the United States was culturally restless and exploring all kinds of things, beyond poetry, beyond the arts. But in the 60s, Anne Sexton was writing prose poetry, Robert Bly, Merwin, James Wright, and Carolyn Forché. There were, of course, others, and later on, John Ashbery and Charles Simic, for example, were writing prose poetry. The trend continued, and it didn't get a lot of notice. There wasn't a lot written about it, critically. But then in the 1990s, there was a number of magazines, literary magazines, that were being published that dealt exclusively in prose poetry. So it's been around a while. I'd also like to mention that, just to acknowledge Haibun, which is the block of text followed by a haiku. But that isn't noted as the beginning of the trend in prose poetry that, when Baudelaire was working in it. So the form itself. Prose poetry, I think the biggest difference is it's not lineated. It is, when you see prose poetry on the page, it's a block. It goes from one margin to the other, no breaks. It uses a lot of simile and metaphor, compression, repetition. There's rhyme, like internal rhyme, uses a lot of figures of speech, but no line breaks, none. I find it really interesting because like a good example would be like Mallarmé's. A lot of his poetry has a lot of white space. So you have time when you're reading to pause and digest what you just read, even if it was a short line. But in prose poetry, you don't have that option. It's horizontal, and there is no white space, so you don't have any breaks, and you feel almost like you're traveling on a one-way street, or a horizontal sliding. And then you get to the end, and that's when you have time to pause and think about, what just happened, what you just read, and what did it mean. Somebody wrote, I'm sorry I don't have the quote, but they wrote that the horizontal nature of prose poetry is like water rushing up to the beach, and then it recedes and it flattens kind of into like foam, and then it disappears. I like that comparison. I thought that was great. Okay. Back to Michael Benedict, too. He writes that, again, metaphor is really important in prose poetry. And that good prose poetry, he says, doesn't, quote, flop all over the place, unquote. And that it takes a keen ear to write prose poetry. It also makes considerable use, as we talked earlier, of is metaphor. And the mind's extraordinary capacity to generate metaphor. Okay. I want to share some prose poetry. Let's see here. Okay. I have a new puppy that's locked up down the hall. I'm very nervous about her exploding, or tearing up the bed pillows, whatever it takes. Okay. I thought this was kind of interesting. This is a short prose poem by Pierre Reverde, and it is translated from the French by Ron Padgett. It's called Street Circus. In the middle of that crowd, there is a child who is dancing, a man lifting weights. His arms with blue tattoos call on the sky to witness their useless strength. The child dances lightly in tights too big for him, lighter than the balls he's balancing himself on. And when he passes the hat and no one gives anything, no one gives for fear of making it too heavy. He is so thin. There's, I have one here. I'm not going to read it, but it's Gertrude Stein wrote a lot of prose poetry. Much of it is in her Tender Buttons. But I found it really interesting that she has, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, almost 7 pages of a prose poem on roast beef. I imagine you're glad I'm not going to share that. This is another one. I just thought it was really interesting. It's called Meeting Ezra Pound. It is by a Czech poet, Miroslav Holub, and it's translated, of course. I don't know what came first, poets or festivals. Nevertheless, it was a festival that caused me to meet Ezra Pound. They seated him in a chair on a square in Spoleto and pushed me towards him. He took the hand I extended and looked with those light blue eyes right through my head, way off into the distance. And that was all. He didn't move after that. He didn't let go of my hand. He forgot the eyes. It was a lasting grip, though, like a gesture of a statue. His hand was icy and stony, and I found it impossible to get away. I said something. The sparrows chirped. A spider was crawling on the wall, testing the stone with its forelegs. A spider understanding the language of the stone. A freight train was passing through the tunnel in my head, and a flagman in blue overalls waved gloomily from the very last car. And it's interesting how long it takes for a freight train like that to pass by. Then they parted us. My hand was cold too, as if I had touched the Milky Way. So that a freight train without a schedule exists, so that a spider on stone exists, so that a hand alone and a hand per se exist, so that a meeting without meeting exists and a person without a person, and so that tunnel exists, the whole network of tunnels, empty and dark, interconnecting the living matter which is called poetry at festivals. So that I may have met Ezra Pound, only I sort of did not exist in the moment. Margaret Atwood has written several pieces of prose poetry. Many of her prose poems, they're like intertextual. They reflect other works. And this one I wanted to share is, it's called In Love with Raymond Chandler. She writes, an affair with Raymond Chandler, what a joy. Not because of the mangled bodies and the marinated cops and hints of eccentric sex, but because of his interest in furniture. He knew that furniture could breathe, could feel, not as we do, but in a way more muffled, like the word upholstery, with its overtones of mustiness and dusk, its bouquet of sunlight on aging cloth or scuffed leather on the backs and seats of sleazy office chairs. I think of his sofas, stuffed to roundness, satin-covered, pale blue like the eyes of the cold blonde, unbodied, murderous women, beating very slowly like the hearts of hibernating crocodiles lounging on his chaise lounge, with their malicious pillows, He knew about front lawns, too, and greenhouses, and the interiors of cars. And this is how our love affair would go. We would meet at a hotel or a motel, whether expensive or cheap, it doesn't matter. And we would enter the room, lock the door, and begin to explore the furniture, fingering the curtains, running our hands along the spurious gilt frames of the pictures, over the real marble, or maybe chipped enamel of the luxurious or perhaps tacky washrooms. And we would inhale the odor of the carpets, old cigarette smoke, and spilled gin, and fast, meaningless sex, or else the rich abstract scent of the over-transparent soaps that have been imported from England. It wouldn't matter to us. What would matter to us would be our response to the furniture, and the furniture's response to us. Only after we had sniffed and fingered, rubbed, rolled on, and absorbed the furniture of the room, we would then fall into each other's arms and onto the bed, king size, peach-colored, creaky, narrow, four-poster, pioneer quilt, lime green chenille covered, ready at last to do exactly the same things to each other. I like that one. I thought that was really fun. Okay, let's see here. And this one, some of you are probably familiar with this. It's, I think, the first prose poem I ever came across. You know, and you notice right away, it's just a giant paragraph, a block of text. And I look like I'm directing you to the exits. Okay. Anyway, I don't know, who knows what, but Forché is often called a poet of witness. She started as a journalist, and she was very young and went to El Salvador in an effort to cover some of those stories was going on during the Civil War. And she had written poems, I think, all most of her life, and ended up writing poems about what she was seeing in El Salvador. And that just launched a career of her traveling around the world, trying to serve as a witness, to terrible things going on. So this particular poem, The Colonel, is about her encounter with a highly placed official in the army in El Salvador. Whether or not he's a colonel, I don't think anybody ever really knows for sure. It doesn't really matter. But just listen for the metaphor and how she sets this up as a perfectly normal scene. Someone invites you over to dinner, you and a friend go, and there's nice food and there's nice wine. The kids are there, maybe, I think, a cat. But then she also throws in these other facts that kind of rattle us. And also think about how on the page, it's a block of text, no white space. So as you're reading, you really have nowhere to go except to the next line. Okay, the Colonel. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the couch beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows, there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table, calling for the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, and a type of bread. I was asked how I was enjoying the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace, and the colonel told it to shut up, and then pushed himself back from the table. My friend said to me, with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, and then dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I am tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, you can tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice, and some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. There's, as I said, a lot going on there. And I found it really interesting how she goes back and forth between a perfectly normal evening and then this lunatic who's hosting it. Powerful, yeah. That's, one of my favorites, always has been. So if you have a moment, I will link these down below. If you have a moment, you can kind of go over them yourself, especially Forché's poem. Atwood's too, because it's just fun. It's silly, and it references all this Raymond Chandler stuff. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons T.S. Eliot never liked prose poetry, because it was referencing other things, he thought. I mean, that's not necessarily true. You can, of course, reference other things, but you don't have to. And Eliot thought that prose poetry did not lend itself to new explorations of new material. So, interesting. Also wanted to mention, I can link these below as well. This is a, let me get that in there, a Penguin Book of Prose Poem. I think there's about 200 prose poems here. And they're arranged in order, like descending order. They go from 2017 to 1842. But lots of really, really interesting things. They're from all over the world. Also, if you're real interested in prose poetry, this is a really cool book too. And I'll link both of those below in case anyone's interested in them. Otherwise, That's all I have. I hope it was helpful. If you have questions or need any of this information, Karen Mann can hook you up, give you my email. And I think that's it. So thank you for listening, and metaphors be with you.